On behalf of Venerable Master Jiru and the community at MABA, we would like to welcome you to an evening with Thanissaro Bhikkhu. Let me introduce you to Sian Kwan Danyeye, one of our lay teachers, who will be moderating this evening.
Welcome, everyone. Just a word or so about our monastery located in Augusta, Missouri, just outside St. Louis in the Missouri River Valley, where over 70 acres are now devoted to providing a quiet and a serene place for people to practice meditation. We are just opening up again after being closed down, of course, because of COVID. So with some restrictions, we're having people coming back live. But in the meantime, we have been having Zoom meditation and Dharma talks on a regular basis. And along with that, we've been inviting teachers from around the world to join us. And we've been very privileged to have Thanissaro Bhikkhu as one of our frequent visitors, coming every few months to giving us teachings during this time, being able to do so despite the time difference, from coming to us from California, just north of San Diego, from Meta Forest Monastery, where he is the abbot, a beautiful place surrounded by avocado groves. This is a wonderful place also that we hope that many of you have a chance to visit once the conditions are favorable for people to travel again and to see each other without concerns about this pandemic that we're hopefully coming out of. So I'm very happy to introduce Thanissaro Bhikkhu to us again. For those of you who are here just for the first time and are not familiar, he is the author of many commentaries on the Buddha's words, and also has translated so many, countless of the Buddha's teachings, the Nikaya, the volumes that of the long discourses and the medium length and the connected discourses, the numbered discourses. He's been a person who has been prolific at being able to help us to gain access to the original teachings of the Buddha, bringing forth his knowledge from his own training in the forest monk tradition. So I could go on, but I know that you're here to experience Thanissaro Bhikkhu himself. So let me turn over the program to him at this time. Welcome back, Ajahn. We're very happy to see you.
Let's start with meditation. Get in a comfortable position. Close your eyes. And think thoughts of goodwill. Goodwill is a wish for true happiness. And because true happiness comes from within, your true happiness doesn't conflict with anyone else's. And so you can have goodwill for all. When you have goodwill for yourself, it's not a selfish thought. You're hoping that you can cultivate the resources you have inside and have more than enough to share. So start with that thought. May I be truly happy? May I understand the causes for true happiness and be willing and able to act on them. And then spread that thought to others. Start with people who are close to your heart, your family, your very close friends. May they find true happiness too. And then spread that thought out in ever widening circles, people you know well and like. To people you like, even though you don't know them so well. To people you're more neutral about. and to people you don't like. Remember that the world would be a much better place if everyone could find true happiness within. Spread thoughts of goodwill to people you don't even know. And not just people, living beings of all kinds. East, west, north, south, above and below, out to infinity. And we all find true happiness in our hearts. Then bring your attention to the breath. Take a couple of good, long, deep in and out breaths. Notice where you feel the breathing process in the body. Focus your attention there. And if the long breathing feels good, keep it up. If it doesn't, you can change. Try to find a rhythm and texture of breathing that feels good for you right now. It might be in long and out short, in short, out long, or in short, out short. Deep, shallow, heavy, light, fast, slow. Experiment for a while to see what kind of breathing feels good for you right now. Or you can simply pose the question in the mind each time you breathe in, what kind of breathing would feel good now, and see how the body responds. If your thoughts wander off, just drop the thoughts. You don't have to wander with them. Get back to the breath. If they pull you away 10 times, 100 times, just keep coming back 10 times, 100 times. Each time you come back, reward yourself with a breath that feels especially good, especially satisfying deep down inside. So they'd be more and more inclined to want to come back and to stay. Now, as the breath gets comfortable, there is a tendency sometimes to forget about the breath and go for the comfort, in which case you lose the foundation for your concentration. So to counteract that tendency, the next step is to breathe in and out aware of the whole body. And a good way to build up to that whole body awareness is to go through the body first, section by section, to familiarize yourself with how the breathing feels in the different parts of the body. And start down around the navel. Locate that part of the body in your awareness. Watch it for a while as you breathe in, breathe out, to see what breathing feels good there. And if you feel any tension or tightness in that part of the body, allow it to relax, so that no new tension builds up as you breathe in, and you don't hold on to any tension as you breathe out. Then move your attention up to the solar plexus and follow the same steps there. In other words, 1, locate that part of the body in your awareness. 2, watch it for a while as you breathe in, breathe out to see what rhythm of breathing feels good there. And then 3, if there's any tension in that part of the body, allow it to relax. Now bring your attention up to the middle of the chest and follow the same steps there. Now bring your attention to the base of the throat and follow the same steps there. Then bring your attention to the middle of the head. As you breathe in, think of the breath energy coming in not only through the nose, but also through the eyes and the ears. In from the back of the head, down from the top of the head, going deep into the brain. As you breathe out, think of it radiating out from the head in all directions. Gently working through any patterns of tension you may feel around the eyes, the jaws, the neck, forehead. And gradually dissolving those patterns of tension away. Bring your attention to the back of the neck, right at the base of the skull. As you breathe in, think of the breath energy entering there from the back and then going down to the neck, the shoulders, the arms, down to the tips of the fingers. And as you breathe out, think of it radiating out from all those parts of the body into the air. Now, keeping your focus at the back of the neck, this time as you breathe in, think of the breath energy entering there and then going down the spine, all the way to the tailbone. And as you breathe out, think of it radiating out from the entire back into the air. Now bring your attention to the tailbone. As you breathe in, think of the breath energy entering there and then going down to the pelvis, the legs, down to the feet and the tips of the toes. And as you breathe out, think of it radiating out from all those parts of the body into the air. Now that completes one cycle in the survey of the body. If you were meditating on your own, you could go through the body as many times as you like. Until you're ready to settle down, to pick up any patterns and tension you may have missed the first time around. But for right now, choose any one spot in the body where it seems most congenial to focus your attention. Focus there and then think of your awareness spreading from that spot to fill the whole body. So you're aware of the whole body breathing in, the whole body breathing out. The range of your awareness may have a tendency to shrink, especially on the out breath. So keep reminding yourself each time you breathe in, whole body. Each time you breathe out, whole body. Allow the breath to find whatever rhythm feels best. Your only responsibility right now is to try to maintain this sense of centered but broad awareness. It's healing for the body, healing for the mind. Because it's still and all around like this provides a good basis for insights to arise. But don't worry about the insights right now. Just try to make this foundation strong. Now I invite you to continue meditating while I give the talk. We carry many maps around in our heads, maps to the physical world, maps to the social world of family, school, work, society at large. Some maps were given to us by others, some we piece together ourselves. In fact, many of these maps have missing pieces, questions we have about areas where the maps aren't clear. So they're like puzzles. And these maps have their purposes, some of which are in our own best interests, and some of which are not. And some of the maps we've outgrown. They serve their purposes, but no longer serve ours, either because we have new interests or because the original purpose was unskillful. Even though some pieces are still missing, we are no longer interested in finding them. We may hang the old maps on the wall, but just as curiosities. However, there are other maps who are more earnest in finding the missing pieces. They're still on the dining room table. When we come to the Dharma, the Buddha presents us with another map, a map to a reality in which the end of suffering is possible. Obviously, it's a map in our own best interest. But often, however, we encounter this map piecemeal. This applies not just to beginners, but also people who've been around the Dharma for a long time. When we come to the Dharma, we tend to bring our own maps with us. with their missing pieces. One common map that we bring has missing pieces in the form of questions or a self-identity. Who am I? What am I? Do I even exist? Another map has questions about the ego. Is the ego a good thing or is it a bad thing? And when we encounter the Buddha's teachings on anatta or not self, it seems to be a piece missing from our pre-existing maps. He seems to be answering these questions, saying either there is no self or there is no separate self, and also saying that the ego is bad. This presents us with two problems. When we try to fit these pieces into our own maps, they don't quite fit. We have to jam them in. And then we look at the other pieces in the Buddhism map, and they don't seem to fit together with the anatta piece. In other words, for example, with karma and rebirth. If there is no self, who does the karma? Who gets reborn? What about the places where the Buddha says that the self is its own mainstay? We should use the self as a governing principle. And as for ego, what about this passage just where the Pali Canon says that conceit is an important part of a skillful attitude you have to develop on the path, even though the path ultimately leads you to the end of conceit, you have to use conceit to get there. The solution to these problems is to look more carefully at the Buddha's map. It's like getting all the pieces that are on the edge pieces and fitting them together as a framework. The framework here has to do with the types of questions that the Buddha would respond to. He had 4 ways of classifying questions, and it's important to keep these in mind. Because when we think about the teaching on that self, it seems to be an answer to the question, do I have a self? Do I not have a self? Do I exist? Do I not exist? But that doesn't fit into the set of questions the Buddha would actually give an answer to. The 4 types of questions are: 1, those to which he would give a categorical answer. In other words, straight, yes, no. This is this, that is that. Then there are the analytical questions. These are ones where the original question wasn't framed quite right, and he had to reframe the question. And the questions, he said, deserved cross-questioning. In other words, he would have to question the questioner first before he's ready to give an answer. And then finally, there are questions that he would put aside. This is where we find that the questions of do I exist, do I not exist, does the self exist, is there a self, is there no self? These are all questions the Buddha would put aside, never answer those questions. I'll give you an example of the analytical and cross-questioning questions. There was a prince one time who was put up to ask a trick question of the Buddha. Would the Buddha ever say anything displeasing? This was a trick question because on the one hand, if he said no, he wouldn't say anything displeasing. He was on record for having said things about Devadatta, the cousin who tried to take over the Sangha, that Devadatta did not like. He said Devadatta was destined to hell, which of course was very displeasing to Devadatta. If the Buddha answered that yes, he would say displeasing things, then you could ask him, well, what's the difference between you and the ordinary people out in the market? So the prince goes to see the Buddha and poses the question. And the Buddha says, there is no categorical answer to that question. The prince realized that the Jains had been foiled. And the Buddha goes on to say, you have to analyze speech into 3 terms. Is it true? Is it beneficial? And when is the right time and the right place to say something pleasing? And when is the right time and the right place to say something displeasing? But even before he gave that new analysis of the question, he did a cross question. So it happened that the prince had one of his baby sons on his lap. And the Buddha asked him, if your baby son got a sharp object in his mouth, what would you do? And the prince said, well, I would hold the back of his head with one hand, and with the other hand, I would crick my finger and stick it in his mouth and get that sharp object out, even if it meant drawing blood. And the Buddha said, in the same way, there are times when it is out of compassion of the people that you're talking to, that you have to say something displeasing, just as you would have to draw blood from the child in order to save the child because you have compassion for the child. So in this particular case, the Buddha answered the question both by cross-questioning the questioner, by giving him an example to show why his answer was going to make sense, and then reanalyze the question. So as I said, though, as for the questions that are put aside, the Buddha would put aside questions about who am I? Is there a self? Is there no self? He gives neither a categorical answer. He doesn't say, yes, there is a self. No, there is no self. He doesn't give an analytical answer. He doesn't say, well, it depends on how you define self. He doesn't talk about there being an interconnected self as opposed to a separate self. That would be an analytical answer. He just refuses to answer the question entirely. So in other words, these questions are not missing pieces in his map at all. If you stick them in, they prevent you from fitting the proper pieces of it in the map. You get stuck in what the Buddha calls a wilderness of views, a contortion of views, a writhing of views. So what questions does the Anatta teaching answer, or the not self teaching? Here it's good to look at what the Buddha's two categorical teachings were. One is that skillful actions should be developed and unskillful actions should be abandoned. And then the second one is a refinement of that principle, the Four Noble Truths. You've got unskillful actions, or basically mental actions of craving. And then the undesirable result, which is suffering. And then you've got skillful actions, which are the factors of the Eightfold Noble Path. And then the good result, which is that you put an end to suffering. So given that we start with these as the categorical teachings, we find that karma comes first. If we want to understand karma, we have to know how anatta fits into the teaching of karma, not the other way around. All too often you hear people say, well, if there is no self, who does the karma and who receives the results of the karma? The Buddha looks at it in another way. He says, given that karma is a principle that operates in our lives, how does the perception of self function as skillful or unskillful karma? And how does the perception of not self function as a skillful or unskillful karma? Think about the questions that the Buddha said at the beginning of wisdom. The question is, what is skillful? What is not skillful? What, when I do it, will lead to long-term welfare and happiness? What, when I do it, will lead to long-term harm and suffering? So I have to see self as an action. In fact, the Buddha actually calls this the action of I making and my making, ahangara, mamangara. There are times when you make a perception of self that can be useful, times when it can be unskillful. And the same with the perception of not self. There are times when it is skillful and times when it's not. So we have to see them both as strategies. Not self is a strategy. Self is a strategy. The Buddha describes both ideas of self and ideas of not self as perceptions. You may have heard of what they call the three characteristics. That's a term the Buddha himself never used. This is one of the advantages we have now that we have the canon on CD-ROM. You can do a search and you find the Buddha never said anything about three characteristics. He talks about anicca, inconstancy, dukkha, stress, and anatta as perceptions. Now there is what they call the sutta, not self-characteristic, but that title of the sutta is not in the canon itself. It's something that the commentary gave it. So the perception of not self is something you do in order to fulfill the duties with regard to the Four Noble Truths. We're trying to comprehend suffering to the point of dispassion. And we're trying to abandon passion for our craving. And there are times when we can use the perception of not self as we apply it to the aggregates of form, feeling, perceptions, thought fabrications, and consciousness as ways of developing dispassion for these things. Because after all, the Buddha defines suffering as clinging to these aggregates. And one of the things you want to learn how to do is to let go of that clinging, and the perception of not self is useful in that context. But he also talks about self as a useful strategy. In both cases, you learn how to use these concepts, self and not self, as strategy for happiness. In the case of self, you think about there are three main roles of your sense of self. One is as the provider of happiness. In other words, you have the abilities to provide it for yourself. Then there's secondly, the self as the consumer, the self who will enjoy that happiness when you're able to find it. And then there's the self as the observer who watches the other two and decides whether they're doing a good job or not. Now in the canon, they recommend as a provider, a sense of self as a governing principle. Excuse me, self as capable of doing this. There's a passage where the Ananda is visiting a nun. And he tells her there are certain things in the path that are actually that you use on the path that you're going to have to let go at the end. And one of them is conceit. And the conceit here is there are people who've been able to gain awakening. They're human beings. I'm a human being. If they can do it, why can't I? Now, in the definition of conceit or mana in the early canon, that would count as a strong sense of self, but it's a useful sense of self that I am capable of doing this. In fact, that's the sense of self that the Buddha wants you to develop, that you are capable and responsible. If you hit your little sister and you say, not self hit my little sister, that's an unskillful use of not self. You have to say, I hit my sister, I'm take responsibility for that. But as you enter onto the path, you also use that sense of self saying, I can do this. If other people can do it, why can't I? I had an experience when I was in Thailand. I was a young monk, newly ordained. And there was another young Thai monk, Chinese, who was ordained at about the same time. And we'd go up in the morning to meditate in this old wooden shack up at the top of the hill. And I'd sit there and I was miserable. Because my legs were paining me, there were mosquitoes, it was hot. And I'd look over at him and he was sitting there very serenely. And I figured, well, if he can do it, I must be able to do it. I can. I've got to defend the good name of Americans here. And so I'd sit through the pain, sit through the mosquitoes. Later on, I found out that he was thinking the same things. He was suffering from the mosquitoes and the pain. He'd look over, here is this American monk who was able to sit there serenely. See, I can't let this American beat me. So that's a case where your sense of self actually helps you on the path. If they can do it, I can do it too. There's also what the Buddha calls the self as a governing principle, in which you may be feeling discouraged in your practice, but then you think for a minute, okay, I entered into this practice because I wanted to put an end to suffering. If I give up, does that mean I don't want to put an end to suffering anymore? I started on this path because I love myself. Do I not love myself anymore? That's actually a useful sense of the self as a consumer. You want to be able to provide happiness for yourself. As for the self as the observer, there's a set of instructions that the Buddha gave to Rahula about how before you act, you ask yourself, this action that I want to do, is it going to lead to harm or suffering, either for myself or for others? And if you see that it's going to lead to harm or suffering, you don't do it. While you're doing it, you say, this action that I am doing, notice the I, it's there in the original text. This action that I am doing, is it leading to harm? Is it leading to affliction? If it is, you stop. After you're done, you look at the results, the long-term results. And if you realize that even though you didn't intend to do harm, there was harm done, you resolve not to repeat that mistake. And, and then you go over and talk it over with someone who's more advanced in the path. In all those cases, you take responsibility for what you did. So these are cases when a strong sense of self is actually a useful tool on the path. It's part of your strategy for finding happiness. This relates also to the Buddha's teachings on ego. He doesn't use the word ego. But when you look into modern psychology, they talk about different healthy ego functions. And the Buddha recommends all of them. You have a different word for them, but he's basically talking about the same sort of thing. For example, they say that a healthy ego employs anticipation. In other words, you see that there are dangers down the road, and so you prepare for them so that you don't have to suffer from those dangers. Well, the Buddha taught heedfulness, which is the same attitude. That you realize, okay, there are dangers down there which I can prevent if I'm skillful in my actions. So that sense of ego is actually something the Buddha recommends. Then there's altruism, in which you see that, okay, if my happiness depends on other people's suffering, then I got to stand for it, so my happiness won't last. I have to take other people's happiness into consideration. That's a healthy ego function. The Buddha doesn't call it altruism, he calls it compassion. There's that famous passage where King Basenadi is one-on-one with one of his favorite queens. And he asks her, is there anyone you love more than yourself? You know what he's probably thinking. She's going to say, yes, Your Majesty, I love you more than I love myself. And if this were a Hollywood movie, it's just probably what she'd say. But this is the Pali Canon. And the Queen Malika is no fool. She says, no, there's nobody I love more than myself. How about you? Anybody you love more than yourself? The king has to admit, no, there's nobody he loves more than himself. So that's the end of that scene. He goes down to see the Buddha, reports what happened. And the Buddha says, you know, she's right. You could search the entire world and you would never find anyone that you would love more than yourself. In the same way others love themselves just as fiercely. And the lesson that Buddha draws from that is never harm anyone or get anyone to do harm to others. For precisely that line of reasoning I said earlier, that if your happiness depends on their harm, they're not going to stand for it and your happiness won't last. So the Buddha teaches altruism, which is another healthy ego function. Teaches as compassion. Then there's what's called suppression. When you see that there is something unskillful arising in the mind, you learn how to say no. The Buddha calls this restraint. You have greed, you have anger in your mind. Well, you learn how not to act on those things. Ultimately, of course, you try to uproot them, but to begin with, the Buddha says you use mindfulness to say no. The restraint is an important part of the path. Again, this is a healthy ego function. Then there's sublimation. If you see your search for happiness is going in an unskillful direction, you try to direct it towards something skillful. The Buddha doesn't use the word sublimation, but he does employ it in the practice of right concentration. You try to develop a sense of well-being inside so that your mind doesn't go for the happiness or pleasures of sensuality. Another healthy ego function is a healthy sense of humor, where you're able to laugh at your own mistakes. Again, the Buddha doesn't talk about humor that much, but there are examples in the canon. In fact, it's interesting that most of the examples of humor in the canon are in the Vinaya, which is the section governing monks' rules. There are stories behind each rule. And often the stories employ humor. And it's interesting to think about why. But one of the reasons, I think, is because if you see that the people who put these rules together had a sense of humor, it makes them a lot easier to live with. And secondly, if you're able to laugh at the kind of misbehavior that the rules are forbidding, it puts you on the side of the rule rather than feeling oppressed by the rule. You see, oh, this rule is pretty wise. There's one case where a monk who had psychic powers did battle with a fire-breathing serpent and was able to subdue the serpent. The word of this gets out. And so the people in the nearby city say, we want to make merry with this monk. And so want to do something special. So they go ask the monks, what is it that monks don't usually get on their alms round? Well, they asked the wrong monks. They got a group of monks who say, we don't usually get hard liquor. And so the next day, everybody prepares a glass of hard liquor for Saketa, who is the monk who did battle with the serpent. So as he takes one glass after another of hard liquor around the city, he finally passes out at the city gate. The Buddha comes along with another group of monks. They see Saketa lying there on the ground. So they pick him up, take him back to the monastery. They lay him down on the ground with his head at the Buddha, toward the Buddha. Well, Saketa has no idea where he is. So he tosses and turns, finally puts his feet right toward the Buddha, which in Asian matters is very unmannerly. And the Buddha says, Saketa, didn't he used to be able to show respect to us? Yes. Does he show respect now? No. And before, did he do battle with a fire-breathing serpent? Yes. Could he do battle with a salamander now? No. So that's the reason why we have the rule that monks are not allowed to have alcohol. There's another story where back in those days, they would have a rotating roster for the monks to give instructions to the nuns. And it turned out to be Julabandika's turn. Word of this gets to the nuns. They say, oh no, this time it's not going to be an effective instruction because he's just going to repeat the same stanza over and over again. Apparently Julabandika had trouble memorizing things. And so they go for the instruction, and after the formalities, he says, okay, here's today's instruction. He starts repeating the stanza over and over again. And the nuns turn to one another and say, didn't we tell you this is not going to be effective? He's just going to keep on repeating this stanza. Well, one, he hears them. Two, it turns out he does have a few tricks up his sleeve. Turns out he has some psychic powers. So he levitates up into the sky, splits into many different versions of himself. Some of them are emitting fire, some of them are emitting light, some are emitting water, some are emitting smoke. And they're repeating many different stanzas of the Buddha, not just that one. And the nuns are looking at this and say, wow, this is the most effective Dharma talk we've ever had. And he gets carried away. And so nightfall comes and he sends them back. Well, they go back to the city, but where the nunnery is. Well, it turns out the city gates are closed. So they have to spend the night outside the city. And then the next morning, as the city gates are open, the nuns come filing into the city. And the people in the city say, oh, here come the nuns after having spent the night out with the monks. So that's why there's a rule that monks are not allowed to instruct nuns after dark. So you can see that the Buddha does recommend humor as an important part of the practice. Finally, as a healthy ego function, there's a sense of shame. And here we're talking about shame not as the opposite of self-loathing or self-hatred. Excuse me, it's not as the opposite of self-esteem. It's the opposite of shamelessness. In other words, you want to look good in the eyes of other people. And ideally, you should want to look good in the eyes of the wise. And this is how admirable friendship works. You have a good teacher and you want to please the teacher by trying to pick up the teacher's good habits. So these are all healthy ego functions that the Buddha recommends. So there are many cases where the Buddha does recommend self as a strategy for making progress on the path. Now, as far as not self, the perception of not self is also used as a strategy for happiness. It's basically an attempt to develop dispassion for things that you identify with. It's basically a value judgment. You look at the things you've been identifying with and you say, is this really worth holding on to? If we analyze this in terms of the Four Noble Truths, you want to look particularly at your cravings that are causing something. You're craving for sensuality, you're craving for becoming, you're craving for non-becoming, all of which tend to focus around the 5 aggregates. So you want to look carefully at the 5 aggregates to see, are these things really worth holding on to? You realize how ephemeral they are and how much stress they involve. Is this stress really worth it? Particularly when you talk about craving that leads to becoming. Now, what is becoming? Bhava is the Pali word. It basically is an identity that you take on in the world of experience. And this too involves the 3 types of self. The self is the consumer, the self is the provider, the self is the observer. But here you want to really develop the observer to see if it really are getting the happiness that you want. Happiness is worthwhile. And you're doing this and you're measuring it against the possibility of an ultimate happiness that comes when you let go of your clingings and cravings. Because if there were no prospect of an unfabricated happiness, the happiness that lies beyond conditions, you'd probably say, well, even though it involves some stress or difficulties, it's still worth it. But the Buddha keeps saying, where there is a happiness, it's the ultimate happiness that comes from letting go of these things. And so you try to develop this passion for them so that you can let go of that craving. You compare the allure of the becoming with the drawbacks. What do you find it feeling? First, you use this to disidentify with things that would pull you off the path, virtue and concentration. In other words, anything that would make you break the precepts, you have to look at it and say, is this worth holding on to? Is this worth latching onto and then breaking my precept? And you have to realize, well, no. The Buddha talks about loss in terms of wealth, loss in terms of health, even loss in terms of your family. He says that kind of loss is not serious. The important things that you would have to be afraid of are loss of your virtue and loss of your goodwill, loss of your right view. And so when you realize, okay, if I had to sacrifice my virtue for the sake of my health, the sake of my wealth, it's a bad deal. I've got to see my health, even my health, as not mine. That's something I have to let go. Same with the distractions and concentration. You're trying to develop a still state of mind. When other things come into the mind, you have to ask, is this really worth thinking about? Seeing that I'm not developing the concentration that would lead me to something better. Then we've taken care of those distractions or those diversions from the path. Then finally, you have to turn on the path itself, because it too is fabricated. For instance, with concentration, the Buddha says your concentration is composed of the 5 aggregates. There's the form, like when you focus on the breath, there's the form of the body, which is the breath. as you feel it within the body. There are the feelings of pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. Here you're trying to develop the pleasure. There are the perceptions that you use to visualize the breath to yourself. As the Buddha said, all the states of concentration are perception attainments. There's the fabrication of directed thought and evaluation, as you try to get the mind to settle down snugly with the breath. And then there's the consciousness of all these things. Here you've got the 5 aggregates right here in your concentration that you've been developing. So there comes a point where you have to say, I've got to let go of this as well. So you apply the perception of not self there. And why do you do that? Again, it's because the Buddha says there is that third noble truth. There's a cessation of suffering that comes when you develop this passion for all fabricated things. In fact, you let go even of the act of discernment that sees these things, that makes use of these perceptions. Okay, again, because you're using the aggregates to develop dispassion for the aggregates. And then you've got to let go of your tools. And the forest tradition, they use the analogy of being a carpenter. You're building a piece of furniture, you've got to hold on to your tools. But when that piece of furniture is done, then you've got to let them go. What remains is what the Buddha calls consciousness without surface. This is a consciousness that lies outside of the 6 sense spheres, lies outside of space and time. And it's totally unchanging. It's called consciousness without surface because it doesn't land anywhere. An image that's found in the canon is of a light beam. The sun rises in the east. The Buddha says, suppose that there were a house with a window on the east side and a wall on the west side. Where would the sunbeam land? It would land on the west wall. If there were no wall, where would it land? It would land on the ground. If there were no ground, where would it land? Back in those days, they believed that there was an ocean supporting the ground. It would land on the water of the ocean. Or if there were no ocean, well, it wouldn't land. Now think about this. A light beam that doesn't land anywhere is invisible. It's bright in and of itself, but you don't see it because it's not reflected by anything. You look out into space where it's black, but you have to realize there's light permeating all of space. Simply, there's nothing reflecting it. That's why you can't see it. Now, some people say this is a crypto-eternal self, but it's not really. It's not in space or time. And there's no sense of self there at all. It's because of this possibility that we're willing to let go of the pleasures of the path. So actually, this unchanging consciousness is a prerequisite for using the perception of not self to begin with, to apply it to even the good things of the path. So both self and not self are strategies for happiness. The Buddha never took a position on whether the self existed or the self didn't exist. But he does say you can use these perceptions as tools on the path. You can use your perception of self. After all, you're already creating a sense of self. So learn how to do it skillfully. And then learn how to take it apart when you no longer need it. So these are strategies for happiness. The skill lies in knowing when and how to use them. When you see them as strategies, rather than as answers to the question of is there a self or is there no self, it clears up a lot of the confusion on the topic. So those are my thoughts on self and not self this evening. I was wondering if you had any questions.
So let me just thank you first for your very clear talk tonight. Very helpful. We have been reading your lectures on self and not self, which we will continue to do on Sundays. We have our 9:30 meditation Central Time and a talk, and then we do the reading around 11 o'clock Central Time, and then we have a little discussion. So this is very, very helpful to us. For those of you who have questions, there are 2 good ways to ask questions. One is to type the question in the Zoom chat box that's available on your screen if you tap it or hit it with the mouse, and Francesca will read your question. The second way is to raise your hand, and Francesca will call on you and mute you. unmute you. So those are two ways that can happen. But I will kick off with a question about this topic, and that has to do with how the Buddha, well, I'm going to ask it from a Theravadan perspective. I hope that that's okay. How Buddhaghosa talks about the four immeasurables and how we want to break through the self. And I'm curious as to how you perceive that process of breaking through the negative aspects of the ego self to be more of an open and equanimous person.
Okay, well, you do that not by destroying your sense of self, but realizing that you have many different selves. I don't know if Buddhaghosa would explain it this way, but it's like we have, you look in your mind, it's like you have a whole committee in there. And each of those is a state of becoming, which is a sense of identity within a particular world of experience. And by training yourself in the same way that the Buddha would train Rahula by saying you want to identify with the part of the mind that does not want to cause affliction. And then of course, you'll see that there will be parts of the mind that resist. And so what you're doing there is you're using a skillful sense of self to overcome an unskillful sense of self. The sense of self that is based on compassion, as I said, to realize that it is really in your best interest. There's an interesting passage where the Buddha says, even to the extent that let go of what is not yours, the 5 aggregates, he said that will be for your long-term welfare and happiness. So he still uses a sense of self as a motivation for using the perception of non-self. And the same would apply for the Brahma Viharas. You develop goodwill and develop compassion because you will benefit.
Thank you. So, Francesca, do you have some questions that have been asked in the chat?
Not yet, Danyaye.
Oh, okay. They're not ready.
Everybody's still pondering here.
That's right. So I have a question that's slightly related, but to some degree clarifying. Could you say some words about the difference or the similarities between the forest monk tradition and the Theravadan tradition? Because I think many people get those confused, and in terms of what's the original school and what isn't. If you could say some words about that, would be helpful for me at least.
Okay, well, you've got, I mean, officially the Thai forest tradition is within the Theravada. Now, the question is how you define Theravada. Primarily in Burma and Sri Lanka, they will tend to define Theravada not only in terms of using the Pali Canon, but also in terms of the commentaries, which would include the work of Buddhaghosa, the Visuddhimagga, material that came in later centuries. In Thailand, there's a long tradition of focusing more on the Pali Canon itself and less on the commentaries. And the Thai forest tradition comes out of that particular approach, particularly with regard to the Dharma. Now, part of that may have been, especially in during the 19th century, a lot of the commentaries had been lost in Thailand. The Burmese had invaded Thailand in the 1780s and destroyed a lot of the libraries. And so Thailand was basically recovering. First, it was recovering the Pali Canon, and then later decades, it was recovering the commentaries. The forest tradition happened to get started during a period when the commentaries had not yet been reestablished in Thailand. And so their approach tends to be much closer to the Pali Canon itself, and not so much in terms of the positions of the commentaries. This is one of this what I talked about this evening is one of the issues in particular. The commentaries tend to say, there is no self. The Buddha himself, as I said, would not address that question at all, whether self existed or not. He also told the monks back in those days, don't get involved in debates. Because back in India in that time, the kings would pose debates. A new king would come into power and say, okay, I want to figure out which religion I'm going to support. So I'm going to call in the leaders of these different religions. I'm going to ask them some questions and hear their different positions on this, hear them debate. And based on that, I'll decide who I'll support. And the Buddha had told the monks, don't get involved in those debates because they're basically, they're not there for the sake of finding the truth. They're basically just there for the sake of winning. And you also have the other problem that if a king poses a question, you can't tell the king, okay, that's a question that should be put aside. Saying basically it's a dumb question. You don't say that to a king. And so some of the monks couldn't resist it. And so they got into that issue. Does the self exist? Does the self not exist? And by the time of they were closing the Abhidhamma and beginning the commentaries, the Theravada tradition had gotten into the position there is no self. The forest tradition has resisted that. There was a great story about Thailand back in the 1990s. There was a group north of Bangkok who proposed that nirvana was your true self. And it's got the scholarly monks all up in arms. And so there were a lot of books and articles written on the topic of nirvana is not self. And can you imagine? I didn't got into the newspapers. People writing, and can you imagine, like, you know, the New York Daily News talking about whether there is a self or is not a self, nirvana is self or nirvana is not self. Someone finally posed the question to Ajahn Mahabua. And he says, is nirvana self or not self? And he said, nirvana is nibbana. He said, what he meant by that is that you use perceptions of self, you use perceptions of not self on the path. Once you get to the end of the path, you have to put those perceptions aside. So this is one of those issues where the forest tradition differs from the commentaries and its interpretations.
So this example that you gave also about how not to get involved in debates reminds me of a story from the Chinese tradition, where there was an emperor. His name was Wen Xuan, and he was very supportive of Buddhism in his own way, and gave lots of money and built temples and things like that. And then when the coffers of the dynasty became lower and lower, he realized that they couldn't support the Buddhist temples and the Taoist temples at the same time. So he decided to call the monks together and have a big debate between the Taoists and the Buddhists. Of course, it was fixed from the beginning because he was supportive of Buddhism. So at the end of the debate, of course, he picked the Buddhists as the winner, and he told all the Taoists that they had to convert to Buddhism. Well, 4 of the Taoists said, no, we really don't want to convert to Buddhism. So King Wen Xuan, in his ultimate wisdom as a good Buddhist, had their heads cut off. Later, he became
That's a good reason to stay away from emperors. Yeah.
Yes, right. He became an alcoholic and died very difficult life, But anyway, so that's a good example, and that's why I don't want to get involved in debates. Yes. So, Francesca, do we have some questions now?
Yes, we do. From Taylor, I am interested in your thoughts on how form and emptiness tie in with self and no self, if such a thing exists.
Okay, I'll talk from the Theravada position. There are passages where the Buddha defines emptiness as being empty of self. In other words, and the Buddha points out that the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, and the object of those senses, these things are all empty of self. And that's one of the definitions of emptiness. This means, it's not saying that these things don't exist. It's just that if they're not worth identifying as you or yours. Now here the Buddha is talking about sort of the ultimate steps in the path when you're going to be letting go of everything. Up until that point, you will be holding on to these things to use them as tools. But you have to learn how to use them as tools and not identify with them as you or yours. That's going to be a gradual process that you develop on the path. Because from the Theravada point of view, the reason we hold on to things is not because we believe that they have a self-essence. We hold on to them because we believe that they're going to be useful for giving rise to happiness, and that the effort that goes into using them is going to be worth it. You know, like this mug. You know, I'm not holding on to it because I think it has a self-essence. I'm holding on to it because it holds some water that I can drink.
Taylor says, thank you for making that connection. We have a kind of a long question here. Thank you for Ajahn for your teaching. In the Majjhima Nikaya, there is a passage, bhikkhus. A bhikkhu is an arahant with taints destroyed, who has lived the holy life, done what had to be done, laid down the burden, reached his own goal, destroyed the fetters of being, and is completely liberated through final knowledge. He too directly knows earth is earth. Having directly known earth is earth, he does not conceive himself as earth. He does not conceive himself in earth, apart from earth, etc. Because he has fully understood it. And the question is, could you please comment on that passage in relation to the popular saying, we are part of nature, everything is interconnected, etc.?
Okay, well, there's a passage where the Buddha says, if you're going to gain insight into things, you have to see them as separate. This goes against a lot of what we hear about, how you have to see everything as being interconnected. But he says you got to learn how to see the objects of the mind as being separate from the mind and as being separate from one another, so that you can see how they interact, but also how you don't want to identify with them. And so here we are not identifying with these things. We're seeing them as tools that we use, but then we don't have to create a sense of self around them. This is one of the big ironies of modern Buddhism, where everything is we identify with being one with the world. And we're saying, no, don't do that. You don't have an identity. Even an infinite identity, he says, is going to cause you to suffer.
Gabriella has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, here, Sarah. I had worked for several years, and upon leaving it, I felt a lessening of self and am resistant to taking up jobs with authority. Could you please advise?
Okay, this is where you've got to decide to what extent you're going to be using a sense of self as a tool that's going to be helpful to you. Because, you know, even the path, the Noble Eightfold Path, is going to involve some stress because you have to hold on to it for a while. There's going to be some clinging. It's based on a desire. And you have to use your discernment to decide, in passive value judgment, is this worth doing? Now, if you've got, if you need the money, you got to say, okay, I've really got to do something, but you look for a job where you can, it's not going to be fostering an unskillful sense of self. But having a sense of authority, well, you learn how to use your authority wisely and learn how to let it go. And it's going to be a really good lesson in how to use a sense of self as a tool rather than, as something you hold it and with a strong sense of identity with.
Thank you, Ajahn. Gabriella has a question. Gabriella?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm asking it like this because it's too complicated to write. Thank you so much for presenting this complicated topic in such a simple way based on karma. It just makes it so clear. So a question has come up, which is, when I'm viewing things from the point of view of the self, then it's pretty straightforward. You go to the instructions to Rahula to know what's skillful, unskillful. But there are times when things of the world are not seen in a self-referential way. And during those times, what I find after the fact is that I act skillfully, naturally, but there doesn't seem to be a check on someone who is checking that there is no unskillful action happening. Could you comment on that? Thank you.
Okay, well, it is good to reflect Because if you start trusting all of your instincts, that sometimes something will come up that you didn't expect. In the Buddha said, if you're going to nurture the Dharma in your life, you have to do two things. One is you commit to the practice, and then two, you reflect on what you're doing. And that's how you learn. So if you find that you're just acting on instinct and then find out, okay, the instincts seem to be right. Okay, you're fortunate, but you have to be a little bit more careful. So I have to check my intention and check my actions while I'm doing them as well. This way, you might pick up some things that you might not have noticed otherwise. Now, you may be afraid, well, if you start checking yourself so much, then you become, become less natural. But you want to learn how to be reflective and natural at the same time. That's a good skill to develop.
The room is pretty quiet here tonight, Ajahn. Anyone else with questions?
Don, you earlier had a question about conventional truth and ultimate truth.
Yes, yes. And we actually went away from your lectures and read together part of your talk on the conventional, the two truths. But I would be happy to have you speak about the two truths, because in the Mahayana tradition, particularly Madhyamaka, there is this strong emphasis on the conventional truth and the ultimate truth. And that's used, I think, as a skillful means by Nagarjuna to try to help explain some things. But your way of looking at it is also important. So please.
Well, the whole reason they had that distinction, it does not come in the early teachings. The commentaries try to base it. They try to find passages in the early teachings which support it. But as I pointed out in that article, that the passages in the canon don't really support that. And the reason they had to come up with the idea of there being two truths was because, as I said, the Buddha talks about using self. The self is its own mainstay, the self as a governing principle, and so on. And yet their interpretation, once they got to the idea, well, there is no self, then the question is the Buddha lying? And so they had to come up with the idea, well, that on the conventional level, the self exists. On the ultimate level, the self does not exist. But when you realize the Buddha never addressed the question, then you don't need those two levels. The Buddha does talk about Paramata, which means sort of, it can be translated as ultimate meaning, and it also can mean ultimate goal. And this is one, and again, this is another area where the forest tradition differs from the commentaries. They'll talk about conventions, all language as being convention, and the only thing that is ultimate is the experience of nirvana, which lies beyond language. So even the language of the aggregates, the language of the sense media, the language of the dhatu, or the elements or properties of awareness, of experience, these two are conventions. The commentary would say that, saying that there is a self is only conventional truth. Analyzing things into aggregates, etc., that would be an ultimate truth. Whereas as I said, the forest tradition would see even aggregates, they're a convention that we use in order to analyze where our clingings are, and even that convention has to be put aside.
This is a deep topic for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, I like the idea that the Buddha never raised the question, and so we don't need those two levels of truth, and it makes things a lot easier.
Yes, indeed. Right. Francesca, I see something being typed up in the chat box. Do you have another question for us?
Yes, I have two questions. The first one, how do we incorporate the sense of self in our daily sitting meditation?
Okay, the sense of self is there as part of your motivation. This is why I'm doing this, because I want happiness. And I want to be the kind of person who can also, be conducive to the happiness of other people. I want to find happiness in a way that is not harming anybody. And you have to be careful, though, as when you get into the actual practice, because there'll be days when it's not going to go well. And if you misuse your sense of self, you might say, I'm a miserable meditator, I have no hope. That's not going to help. That's when you put that's that sense of self you put aside. And you just try to look at, okay, what am I doing? What are the results? What can I change so I can get better results? So you don't want to use your meditation as a measure of how good or bad a meditator you are, or how much hope or hopelessness you have in the path. Again, the sense of self can be used in an unskillful way, so you have to watch out. Just as I pointed out, the sense of not self can be used in an unskillful way. You say, well, there's nobody here doing this, so I just have to sit here with causes and conditions as they happen to unfold. That's not going to help either. You do have to take some responsibility for what you're doing, but realize, okay, you have the opportunity to act in more skillful ways.
Do we have another question, Francesca?
Yes. May I ask the difference between reflection and checking? I tend to check myself too much. Thank you.
Okay, reflection is basically every now and then you check in. Don't check so much, but check in and say, okay, what am I doing? What are the results? Are the results satisfactory? If they're not satisfactory, what can I go back and change? But John Lee likes to make the comparison with developing a skill, say like learning how to weave a basket. You weave a basket, okay, then when it's done, you look at the basket you've got, and is this a satisfactory basket? When you start out, it's not going to be very good. So you have to ask yourself, well, okay, what did I do wrong? That means you have to be aware of what you're doing while you're doing it, and then see what the results are. But learn, if you find that you're checking yourself too much and you're feeling thwarted, you might say, okay, let up a little bit and look at the results after I'm done with a particular action, and then ask myself, okay, what can I do better the next time around? And learn how to, you've got to learn how to develop the critical voice in your mind in such a way that it actually is helpful and it's not destructive. This is usually the problem with checking yourself too much, is your critical voice inside tends to be too critical and is basically seeming to be aimed at making you hopeless. You can ask yourself, okay, who is that in my mental committee? This is where it's good to think of the mind as a committee. And some of the members want to thwart your practice. They want to go back to how things were before you started practicing. And those are the ones you've got to watch out for, because sometimes they can dress themselves up as a Dharma and then get you pretty miserable. So if there's a critical voice in the mind and it seems to be destructive, ask yourself, okay, why are you trying to destroy my happiness? What's the advantage? And it will probably say, well, if it's honest, it will probably say, well, I want to find happiness another way. I don't like this.
It's distracting to have all that going on.
Right, right.
We still have a few more minutes for questions. Let's see. Do we get a sense of nibbana along the path? What would be the examples of such an experience? It's difficult. I know it's difficult to get a sense of the undescribable.
Okay, what you're going to be getting along the path is the pleasure of concentration. Now, this is not a taste of nirvana, but it's reminding you, okay, that true happiness for the mind, it does come from a sense of stillness. It comes from a sense of being able to settle into the present moment. And if this is good, imagine how good nirvana can be. You're not going to get a taste of the goal until you have your first taste of awakening. But try to develop a sense of peace around the concentration, and learn how to appreciate that sense of peace, the sense of well-being that comes from that. And that'll give you some energy on the path. It's like going to the Grand Canyon. There are two routes to the Grand Canyon. If you've ever been there, if you come to the south, you go to the south rim. One of them, you're going across this sort of desolate plain, and all of a sudden, bang, there's the Grand Canyon with no forewarning. There's another one where you come from the southeast. You're actually following what's called the Little Colorado River. And that has a little canyon that goes along parallel to the road. You say, okay, there is a canyon. I heard there was a canyon in this area. This is a canyon. It's kind of nice. But then when you get to the Grand Canyon, you realize that the Little Colorado Canyon there was no comparison at all.
We have another question for you. What do you see as to the necessity of learning to master the jhanas?
It's part of right concentration. And as you learn how to master those levels of concentration, you're going to be learning a lot about the processes of fabrication, how the mind fabricates its experience in the present moment. There are three kinds of fabrication the Buddha talks about, excuse me, the canon talks about with relationship to the practice of concentration. There's bodily fabrication, which is the in and out breath. There's verbal fabrication, directed thought and evaluation, is the way you talk to yourself. And then there's mental fabrication, which is composed of perceptions and feelings. Perceptions are the labels the mind places on things. Feelings, of course, are feelings of pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. And you're going to find out as you practice concentration, the extent to which you actually can create these things or direct them in a way that gives rise to this state of concentration. And that makes you more and more sensitive to the process, the fact that you are constantly putting together your experience all the time. Because these three levels of fabrication are also involved with any emotion that you're going to be getting involved with in the course of the day. And it gives you a better sense of how you can, if you're entangled in an unskillful emotion, you can pull out and ask yourself, how am I breathing? How am I talking to myself about the issue? What are the perceptions I'm holding in mind? Can I change these things? This gives you a way of stepping out of your whatever emotion you find yourself in. So the concentration is really good at sensitizing yourself to those processes. And as the Buddha said, it's food on the path. It gives you your nourishment. Ajahn used to say, if you don't get a sense of refreshment and pleasure from your practice, it gets pretty dry very fast. And the concentration is the food that keeps you going.
Francesca, was there one other question?
Yes, and it's a follow-on. You just mentioned in the question about nibbana that along the path we get tranquility. What about bits of freedom coming from insight?
Those come along as well. But again, they're very, very small compared to the freedom that comes when you actually hit one of the levels of the unconditioned. There's a passage where the Buddha there are two passages where the Buddha talks about equanimity. We discussed this in our earlier passage, in our earlier discussion. And I began to realize when the Buddha is talking about developing equanimity on a more solid basis, in one case, it's you develop a sense of well-being that comes from insight as you begin to pull yourself away from the ups and downs of your sensory experience. And that sense of well-being then is conducive to a stronger state of equanimity. There are other cases where you develop a sense of well-being through developing concentration. So either way, whether you're getting energy in your practice from the insights or energy from the concentration or both, these are all to the good. But the insights are going to get more and more profound as you get stronger and stronger in your concentration. As the mind is more still, it sees more subtle things.
Looks like we may have one more question slipping in before our closing today. I'm going to ask Ajahn in a moment if you would lead us in a dedication of merit. But before that, is there one more question, Francesca?
No, there's not. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and donations for Metta Forest Monastery are gratefully accepted at our website. So thank you.
Okay. Yes. And I want to wish you well as the retreat, the range retreat period will start relatively soon for you. So wishing you a good period during that time as well. would you be able to lead us in a dedication of merit at the end?
Sure. Well, dedicating merit is very simple. You stop and think about the good that you've done. And then you dedicate it either to individual people, relatives, friends who passed away, or to all living beings. May anyone who approves of the good that I have done rejoice in that, and in doing so, they will gain the merit of approving of something good. May all beings be happy. Okay, may you all be well.
Thank you very much for joining us again, and we'll see you on the other side of the retreat, we hope.
Okay.
And thanks to everyone who has joined us tonight. We will make available to you information about how to continue to follow up on this with our Sunday practices. And may you all continue on the path and find your way to happiness as well.
Okay, take care.
Sadhu, sadhu.
Thank you, Ajahn.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Take care.